Welcome everyone to the third installment of our Working Tools seminar series. My name is Andrew Martindale, and I'm here on behalf of Eric Simons and Alison Wiley as organizers of community-facing data management platforms for Indigenous university partnerships. If you've missed any of our talks thus far, they're all available on the website, and I'm going to post that link in the chat after the introduction. I'd like to begin by acknowledging our Musqueam hosts at UBC Vancouver for their hospitality and allowing us to live and work on their traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory. And this week I draw from the UBC Student Services, whose acknowledgement includes the following text. It's important that this recognition of Musqueam territory and our relationship with Musqueam people don't appear as a formality. Take a moment to appreciate the meaning behind the words we use. Traditional recognizes the lands traditionally used and or occupied by the Musqueam people or other First Nations in other parts of the country. Ancestral recognizes that this is handed down from generation to generation. And unceded refers to land that was not turned over to the Crown or government by treaty or other agreement. And it's especially valuable in this series to reflect on the complex meanings of the land acknowledgements that we use. And this week, I'm going to draw your attention in the chat to the book that Sue mentioned last time, Hannah Turner's volume from UBC Press titled Cataloging Culture, Legacies of Colonialism in Museum Documentation. And I'll put that link in the chat as well. A few guidelines. Please make sure that your microphones and video feeds are turned off. It's perhaps less critical this time, but we want to be attentive to bandwidth for Ezra. If you have a question or a comment during the presentation, please add it to the chat or let us know that you'd like to ask something. Eric Simons will compile these for discussion after the presentation. And hopefully you got the email that the presentation by David Sheppy and his colleagues that was originally scheduled for today has been postponed until December the 11th. We're delighted instead to introduce Ezra Greene, who volunteered on very short notice to fill in, and Sue Rowley will provide us with an introduction to Ezra and his presentation. Sue.
Okay, so it's great to be back, and thank you, Andrew, for giving me this chance to make the segue from my talk to this next talk. It's a real pleasure to introduce Ezra Greene, who I've known since about 2003, I believe. And don't worry, Ezra, I'm not going to show pictures of you holding a two-tusked narwhal from one of our first voyages. Ezra holds a Bachelor in Anthropology from UBC, a Master's in Social Sciences and Comparative Education from UCLA, an Advanced Diploma in GIS from BCIT, and he worked with the Stalo Research and Resource Management Center when he was doing that diploma. He has also worked for the Lab of Archaeology on our database, and he has almost completed his thesis for his PhD here at UBC in anthropology, looking at Inuit ways of learning the land. And you know your students are in the right place where your Zoom session is canceled, not because they decide they don't want to show up, but because you get a radio call from Chesterfield Inlet saying that Ezra and Krista have radioed in to let you know that they're stuck on the land and won't be able to make the Zoom. So not only does Ezra cover the details when he's doing his research, it's really wonderful to watch the way that he delves deeply into a topic, but he also has the capacity to step back and look at the connections and the big picture. So it's really only fitting that today he's talking about Nunangwa Liornyok, map making with Inuit. So Ezra.
Okay, thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks, Sue. I want to thank you for making the land acknowledgement for the Musqueam land at UBC. And I also want to just briefly state where I am, which is in Ottawa right now, the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thanks to Andrew, Eric, and Allison for organizing the Working Tools talk series. I'm really excited for all the talks that are happening. And thank you to Green College as well for hosting it. When I was at UBC doing my coursework, I helped organize a talk series, and it was one of the best things that I did. And I met some great people while doing it. Just a little bit about my background and where I come from. I was born and raised in the Intermountain West of the United States, in Logan, Utah, which is Shoshone-Bannock territory. And I actually didn't know that until I was about 20 years old, and I did a paper in an anthropology course, and I learned about the people from where I grew up. And I also learned that one of the biggest massacres of American Indian people happened in the valley where I grew up. And some of what I'm presenting today, what I think is important, is it works towards creating maps that show the indigenous history of the land and the indigenous connections and stories, which are really, really important. So we're going to see some examples of that. As already mentioned, I did my undergraduate at UBC, and I spent many years working in the Museum of Anthropology and the Laboratory of Archaeology, including doing work that fed into the Reciprocal Research Network, which was talked about 2 weeks ago. And I worked at the Stalo Research and Resource Management Center when I started my PhD, which will be presented next week by Dave Sheppy and Matt McGinnity. And I also want to mention Sue Formosa, who I think is on here. She was really, really integral in being a mentor for me in this, and she's really done some groundbreaking work in this kind of field and this method of using GIS for both archaeology and anthropology. So broadly, I'm going to get my PowerPoint going now. Oh, I got to share the screen, don't I? Can everyone see it so far?
Not yet. Oh, here we go.
You can see my screen. Okay.
Yep.
So my talk is called Nunangwa Liukna, and so I'll talk about my broad research interest first. I'm interested in knowledge systems and ways of knowing, intergenerational knowledge transmission, and how lived experience and expertise get integrated into resource regulatory regimes as traditional knowledge, or Inuit Kamaitukangi, which is what traditional knowledge is called in Nunavut. My specific research interests are how Inuit in the Kivalliq region of Nunavut pass on Inuit predominantly land-based knowledge from one generation to the next, and I'll get a little bit into that towards the end of this presentation. My presentation is called Nunangwa Liuknik, and just to kind of break that word down, so in Inuktitut, words are created by basically combining what the very sophisticated linguist Mick Malone calls word chunks together. So Nuna means land, Ngwak resembles or like, so Nunangwak is like the land or a map, and Liup means to make, so Nunangwa Liup Tunga would be I make a map. And Nip it turns it into an abstract noun. So Nunangwa Liuknip means map making, and I've added with Inuit because that's the main focus of my presentation here. So just to provide a brief outline of where we're going here. My main purpose is to present methods and some theories about participatory mapping as a form of doing social science research that can lead to really cool and interesting projects, like many of those that have been highlighted in the working tool, or will be highlighted in the working tools talk series. And my secondary purpose is to provide a historical outline of research projects with Inuit that have been integral in developing participatory mapping methods. I'm actually going to get to that by getting into the historical sketch of Inuit contributions to geographic projects first, and then coming more to the participatory mapping and some examples from my own research. So, to begin with, understandings of space and geography, of course, exist. They've existed for people forever, really, and I think. And so, to just a brief introduction of, there's a paper that was written in the 1970s by authors named Spink and Moody. I don't think they were Hogwarts professors, but they may have been. They write about sort of this part of the presentation. And they talk about what were the geographic representations by Inuit for Inuit like. One thing they mention is short-lived sketch maps that would have been made in sand or snow with sticks and bones to help other Inuit get to know an area they may not have been to. And there's actually documentation from Captain Frederick William Beechey, who was an explorer in 1826, about Inuit making three-dimensional maps by piling sand and stones up to create mountains and islands, and then using sticks and bones to represent where fishing camps and villages were. Other portable geographic representations could have been maps drawn on skins, but there aren't actually any known in the archaeological or the ethnographic record. So if they did exist, they probably weren't super widely used. And then finally, the picture that you see here is some wooden carvings that Captain Gustav Holm collected in 1884-85 on the west coast of Greenland that were made by an Ammassalik Inuk man. Inuk is the singular form of Inuit, so if I say it, it basically means person. So an Ammassalik Inuk man named Kuni had carved these representations of the Greenlandic coastline, which you can kind of see on the picture on the right, and given them to Gustav Holm. So at this point, this is pretty long into when contact had happened in Greenland. But what I think it's showing is the representations of space can be pretty different culturally. And then finally, I want to just mention the importance of language. Inuktitut, or Inuktitut, the Inuit language, is extremely precise in describing locations. The prepositions, or what they're called whereats by McMahon, to describe where something is, are far more complex in Inuktitut than English. They have words for describing where something is up high or down low or behind you, whether it's moving towards you, away from you, through something. And so these are like individual words, whereas in English we need a whole combination of words to kind of convey that meaning. So the Inuit language describes space very precisely. And the other thing is, what I really notice a lot when you're talking to Inuit is when they're telling a story on the land, they do what I call verbal bookmarking, and they kind of name a whole series of places that identify where a story is happening. So there's a lot of attention within the language to that. So now moving on to explorers' interactions with Inuit. So exploration started as early as the 1500s and 1600s, and there wasn't a lot of interaction with Inuit for a while. But in the 19th century, there's a handful of explorers who really began to interact with Inuit a lot. And there's some pretty important ethnographic records in explorers' journals. But one thing that they did is they had Inuit who were visiting or living around their ships while they were iced in the winter draw maps. And so I'm going to share one example of that from Captain John Ross, Sir John Ross, who wintered near the Boothia Peninsula, which is on the Arctic coastline, from 1830 to 1833. He was basically stuck in ice with his crew for 4 years, and then they finally were got out. But in the first winter, on January 11th, 1930, a group of Inuit showed up, and two of them, named Tuluahiu and Tiagashu, went onto a ship, and he showed them charts that had been made by previous explorers, as well as some other drawings by Inuit from the previous exploration. And the Inuit, once the names were said, they knew all the places. He says, Ross wrote, they were acquainted with every place between Igloolik and Repulse Bay, or with their names at least, and with those of some of the inhabitants. So they knew people who lived in those areas. They pointed out an inlet called Akulik, and as soon as they knew that, they knew how they had gotten from Akulik to where the ship was iced in, because the map didn't actually extend to where John Ross was. And then Tuluahiu and Tiagashu started to draw the map. And as they were drawing, they drew coastlines, they drew their own travel routes, they drew islands, rivers, and lakes. And distances on the map were explained by how many days they had traveled to get from one spot to another, and how many nights they'd slept. In addition to geographic features, information was also shared about lakes where fish could be found and where to expect other Inuit encampments and overland routes to more salt water. And what I find really interesting is Tuluahiu and Tiagashu, they said, we're not the best geographers. We can actually bring somebody who can draw a better map for you. And so the next day, Tiagashu brings a man named Ikmalik, who's in this picture, to the ships. Captain Ross shows Ikmalik the sketch that had already been made, and Ikmalik starts to draw his own version of it over it. Some of it is more or less the same as Tiagashu and Tuluahiu's map, but at certain points he starts to go more to the west and to the northwest, which is kind of funny in the journals, because these explorers were like just looking for any clue they could for the Northwest Passage, right? So anytime the coastline goes west or northwest, you actually read an excitement about what's happening. And Ross isn't the only explorer who wrote like this. There's other examples where there's sort of a hint of the Northwest Passage and they get really excited. So this is the maps. The one on the left is what was produced from the drawing that Tuluahiu, Tiagashu, and Ikmalik did. So it's sort of a combination of theirs that was produced in the report. And on the right, I have a satellite image from Google Earth. What you see is it's not a perfect to scale representation of sort of what we see in the satellite imagery, but it's pretty darn close. And the detail of what's there is pretty unique. You also see lots of, there's little circles on the points. So those are camps where the Inuit had stayed, traveling from Akulik, which is in the bottom right-hand corner, up to where the ship was iced in, which is Felix Harbor in the sort of upper left-hand corner. And the place names are there. So nowadays it's quite easy to match where each of these points is to the land because the place names continue to be used. So that's an example of charts that were drawn by Inuit. In addition to charts, guiding, provisioning, and translating was extremely important and sort of contributing to Europeans' geographic knowledge. Inuit guides were vital in ensuring that explorers, anthropologists, and other researchers could travel safely in the Arctic, as they taught them how to dress, how to travel, they kept them provisioned, they translated, they built housing for them, and more. While not everyone was sketching charts, guides were extremely important. Did I get muted? Can people hear me still?
We can hear you now. It went off for just a second.
Okay. Yeah, it said I got muted for some reason. We're good though?
Yep.
Okay. So some of the Inuit who were guides traveled extensively on multiple expeditions. So I've provided just a list here of where Joe Ipikpik and Hana Takulituk traveled. I'm not going to go over every single bit, but Joe Ipikpik and Hana Takulituk were a married couple, and they were originally from Baffin Island. They actually went to England for a couple of years. They were received by the Queen of England, and while there, Takulituk learned English quite well. And then they went on 3 expeditions with Charles Francis Hall, which one was sort of focused on Baffin Island, one was more in the area around Boothia Peninsula and Repulse Bay from the maps I just showed, as well as King William Island. They were looking for the Franklin expedition, any survivors from the Franklin expedition. And then the third, they went to northern Greenland and Ellesmere Island, trying to get to the North Pole. Charles Francis Hall actually passed away on that, and this accident happened, and 19 people ended up on a piece of ice, like a floe of ice that broke away. It drifted over 2,000 kilometers to the coast of Labrador, and the 19 people who were on it survived. Because Joe Ipikvik and another Inuk who was from Greenland named Hans Hendrik Swapsak basically hunted, and they hunted seals and polar bears and whatever was on there, and they kept everybody alive. And then Ipikvik, after Takulituk passed away, ended up going on one more really big expedition overland from the Hudson Bay to King William Island. Okay, so now that was sort of exploration. Now I'm going to move into sorry, I have my notes mixed up here. I'm going to move into anthropologists and early anthropologists. Anthropologists were like explorers. Some of the early ones who came and they met with Inuit, they oftentimes had them draw maps. one of the first anthropologists who wrote an ethnography from what became the Canadian Arctic was Franz Boas. Another one who traveled from Greenland all the way to Siberia and had Inuit draw maps all along the way is Knud Rasmussen as part of the 5th Thule expedition. I'm going to focus on Boas right here, but I'm guessing there's a lot of anthropologists and archaeologists in the audience. We know a lot about Franz Boas's ethnography and anthropology contributions. He also had some pretty major geography contributions. So in 1883-84, he went to Cumberland Sound, which is in the southern Baffin Island, and he was actually on a German geography expedition, from what I remember. And so when he first got there, it was the summertime, and he borrowed a small whaling boat and was surveying the coastline from the boat. And then as it became fall, Inuit who had been hunting in other areas started to show up around where he was staying, which was near the whaling station. And so he started visiting the Inuit camps and talking to them, getting to know, doing the ethnography or the anthropological fieldwork. He had Inuit draw maps, and the two here on the left are two maps drawn by Itu and Sunapingno. And the third one on the right is a map produced from aerial surveying. So what I find fascinating here is that they're, like I said before, they're not perfect representations, but they're pretty darn good. There's slight differences, like the peninsula in the middle of Frobisher Bay and Cumberland Sound. It's wider on the first one and thinner on the second one, but you get just a ton of detail about the islands and the inlets. And what's remarkable to me is that if you look at the map on the right, the line on the bottom, the scale, that's 100 miles long. Frobisher Bay and Cumberland Sound are like 150 to 200 miles long. So the amount of geographic recall in these maps is phenomenal, especially for people who had probably had fairly little interactions with maps. It's pretty amazing to me. I don't think I could draw something this accurate from my memory alone. And then, as I said, Boas had really important geographic contributions. So he traveled, like once winter came, he traveled by dog team extensively with Inuit. He traveled over 2,400 miles in the one winter that he was in this area, and he mapped while he was traveling around. So it's a little bit hard to see because I've changed the contrast to make it easier to see. So it's hard to see where the difference is from what existed prior to Boas's work and then what he did. But basically everywhere along the coastline where there's kind of a shading around the coastline is what Boas contributed in a geographic article. And then some of the, like where it says Akudnik, and then also some of the other areas are the lines that the British Admiralty had prior to Boas's work. So he just made major contributions that kind of refined the European understanding of the geography. And this, without a doubt, was made possible because he was traveling with Inuit. They knew how to travel, they knew where to travel. So it's another example of the importance of guiding and provisioning and translating. And then one more. So now we're gonna jump from sort of the 1880s to the 1930s. And this I find is this is a little bit of an anecdote that I've always found interesting. So Sue Rowley's father, Graham Rowley, did 2 expeditions to the Arctic, and he traveled extensively by dog team. And on his second expedition, he had actually looked at maps that were in Boas's ethnography, the Central Eskimo, or I prefer to say the Central Inuit. And there was other maps, and some of them showed travel routes of Inuit, and one of them had this travel route across northern Baffin Island that was on the map. And so Rowley thought, I'm going to try to find that route. And he asked Inuit who he knew and who he was traveling with, does anybody know about this route? And people knew about it, they had heard about it, but no one had traveled it in living memory. So he talks to his guide and his traveling partner and hunting partner, Kutyuk. And Kutyuk says, yeah, I want to go. Let's try to figure that out. And Kutyuk decides he's also going to bring his 10-year-old son, Panik Pakutu. So they're headed there to a, I don't have the names. So they're headed to the inlet, Kangaklukjuap, and they're almost to where the mountain pass kind of starts. And another Inuit shows up named Minu. And Graham knew Minu from beforehand because he had traveled on the previous expedition with Reynold Bray and Graham. And Reynold was actually supposed to be on this expedition, but sadly, he had passed away while he was on it in a boating accident. He had drowned. Graham describes Minu as, Minu was the same undistinguishable, unproposing, and unassuming character that Reynold and I had grown to like and appreciate very much. He was difficult to describe except in negative terms, but he was always cheerful, anxious to help, and well-liked by other Inuit. He was the sort of man who had learned not to expect much out of life, but was happy to make the best of whatever it offered, cast in a supporting role, not as a principal. And I like that because one thing is Inuit really, they recognize differences and personality differences. So not everybody has to be like the super hunter guy that's sort of the leader of an expedition. Other people are just as important to the group. And so yeah, Minu joins. Graham finds out shortly afterwards that Minu actually has an ulterior motive while he's on this trip. He had recently lost his wife who had passed away, and he was in search of a new wife. So perhaps he thought being part of this, that would happen. They ended up finding the route. They crossed Baffin Island, and Rowley mapped the route by using what's called dead reckoning, where basically you are using a compass to know which direction you're going, and you're using a clock to determine how long you're going in that direction, and then you draw it out afterwards. So the map on the left shows, the left part of the map on the left shows what Graham drew on his expedition, and then the right part of that map shows what the aerial map looks like. So it's pretty darn accurate again. And of course, it's made possible with the help of Inuit. They ended up getting to around Pond Inlet. Minu didn't find a wife while he was with Graham, but shortly afterwards, he was with Kutyuk off hunting somewhere, and he came back with a wife. He married somebody who was widowed as well, and he adopted her children. So there was a happy ending to that story. And basically, the route that had been known in Inuit history was experienced again through this journey and reestablished. The picture on the right upper one shows the route through the mountain pass. And then on the bottom right, there's a picture of Minu and Reynold Bray from the first expedition that Graham had gone on. So now jumping up to the 1970s. This is the Inuit Land Use and Occupancy Project. And in a lot of ways, this is like a foundational project for what we're going to talk about, participatory mapping, and what is also known as the map biography, or a similar, I guess, method called the map biography. This project was initiated by Inuit Taparisat of Canada as they worked towards negotiating a comprehensive land claim. And Inuit in nearly every community in the Western Arctic and Baffin Island, essentially what is now known as the Inuvialuit Settlement Region and Nunavut, participated in this project. Milton Freeman led the project and created Milton Freeman Research Limited to do it. And the research involved an extensive team of researchers that included 120 local Inuit fieldworkers, interpreters, and interviewers, as well as all the people who got interviewed. The method that was employed was pretty groundbreaking, and it had a major impact on the future of Canada. Basically, the method was to interview individual hunters about where they had hunted, where they had camped, where they had fished, and draw it down onto maps. They used 1 to 500,000 scale maps, which hunters were used to using at that time. And the picture in the middle shows kind of what a map might look like after doing one of the interviews. So let me just say, so in total, over 1,600 interviews happened during this project. And they created So I'm jumping around a little bit. So basically after interview, number 2 map there in the middle looks kind of what it looks like. And then once you've had lots and lots of interviews, you can start to combine the data, layer the data. And the picture 3 is basically showing a bunch of polygons which represent different interviews, but they all represent where caribou hunting is happening. And then in the picture number 4, it's like they've combined all of those layers into one to represent caribou hunting. And picture number 5 is showing not only caribou hunting, but other categories as well. So I don't have the legend, I don't know what they are, but maybe muskox hunting, fishing, or different activities on the land. And the picture on the right is showing from Chesterfield what all the interviews combined looked like during a certain time period. I forget what time period it is. It's 1912 or 19 something to 1950 something. I can't see it on the screen right now. After they've done all this, they have this huge amount of map data. And in the report, it says that the map data was added to a comprehensive geocoded computer access database. Data was recorded onto punch cards, and then the punch cards were input into a computer and recorded to magnetic tape for future use. So honestly, I don't even know how that's done, but it's like the beginnings of GIS, essentially. So that's the Inuit land use and occupancy projects. The research basically helped establish the land base from which Inuit negotiated both the Inuvialuit land claim and the Nunavut land claim. And in a lot of ways, it helped create the territory of Nunavut, or where that would be anyway. I want to just point out that other projects were happening around the same time that were similar. Dene Nation had a huge mapping project. It never got published in the same way though, largely because of the history of the land claims, and they kind of splintered into several different land claims. So moving forward, there's been a lot of other really cool and really interesting projects with Inuit that have to do with mapping. And I'll just sort of briefly go over these, and then we're going to get into mine. But the Inuit Heritage Trust has done a massive Inuit place names project. And that first map is basically all of those red dots are place names, and you can click on them and see them. A lot of them have explanations of what they mean. So that's that. With GPS technology and handheld computers, similar to what Elroy presented in the first presentation, you can map where you are all the time, and you can log things while you're mapping. So one example of a project where that kind of technology has been used is the community-based monitoring project. And the software that is actually that project runs on is the Trailmark software, which I think is going to get presented by Peter Evans later. Basically, while people are out on the land, they're tracking where they're going, and they're recording observations of things like wildlife sightings and hunting spots and whatnot. Also, a lot of these projects are community-based participatory research projects, where communities are very, very, very involved in how they're happening, and they're directing them, and there's a lot of collaboration happening between communities and researchers. One researcher who's just been phenomenal in doing that, I think, is Gita Lubicic, and she's done a lot of these projects, as well as her graduate students. So this picture on the sort of upper right is a project that's happening currently in Joe Haven called the Caribou and Sea Ice Crossings Project. That's being led by Gita Lubicic, her student Emily Paquette, and Simon Ukpakuk, who is a community researcher from Joe Haven. Gita used to be at Carleton University, and she's moved to McMaster, but Carleton has this really amazing research center called the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center. And what they've done is they're trying to combine GIS with the powers of the internet, and bringing in, you can combine like geographic data, you can combine audio data, photography, similar to what Sue showed with the Reciprocal Research Network. But they create what are called cyber cartographic atlases, and a lot of them have been with Inuit. The one on the bottom left is showing trails, and you can actually see it's hard to see, but I picked a spot that's a place name, and that map I showed earlier in the presentation, the data from it's actually been used to bring into this. One thing I've noticed looking at this is they don't actually have the route that Graham Rowley and Kutyuk and the others went on, so they missed one. And then more recently, Siku Atlas is a project by the Arctic Ider Society, which is using telephone applications. You can basically get an application on your phone and anybody can enter data. So it's a lot more crowdsourced, volunteer geographic information that is creating that project. And it's really popular in Sanikiluaq, which is a community in the Hudson Bay. So now to just define participatory mapping a little bit more. How am I doing on time? Pretty good. Broadly, participatory mapping is when local community members participate in creating maps of their community and local areas. It is a ground-up approach to geography where locals create maps rather than a top-down, high-level government institutions creating maps. Frequently, it involves support from organizations or researchers who help with technical aspects of the projects. And oftentimes, the projects are related to local engagement in governance and planning and resource management. And a lot of times, it's creating representations of space, which are very much cultural and driven from the community, and not the same as, say, a territorial government might produce or a federal government might produce. There's critiques on how participatory mapping can be. I've cited one sort of that'll get you to start looking at, it's like the beginning of the rabbit hole of critiques. But basically what I'll say here for now is that different projects have different levels of participation, and some are far more community-based and community-oriented than others. I think with my own research, it started as really community-supported mapping, but more and more projects that I'm doing are becoming participatory, and I've worked more and more with organizations in the communities where I work. So my own research for my PhD is called Learning the Land. And I've been really interested in how Inuit in the communities of Rankin Inlet and Chesterfield Inlet on the west coast of the Hudson Bay are passing on Inuit knowledge about the land from generation to generation, how that's happening today, how it's changed some through time, what are the role of like adults in it, in the current sort of transmission of knowledge. What are some of the strengths and what are some of the challenges in these processes? So that's really generally what my research is about. And I'm not going to get too much into my conclusions or my findings. That's more for my oral defense, which hopefully is happening soon. But one of the methods that I used is participatory mapping. And I did interviews where I talked to people about where they learned. Where did you learn to hunt? Where did you learn to, or where did you start camping, and what did you learn while you were camping? And this is a picture of what they kind of look like. I would travel around the town with maps and bring them to people's houses a lot of the time. Sometimes I did it in hamlet offices and whatnot, but I would bring an audio recorder and record the conversations as long as people gave me permission to do that. And then we'd go through a series of questions, which I just mentioned. And as we're talking, we do mapping on it. So I would sometimes do the mapping. I had a whole series of codes that represented different things. So there was a certain amount of, I guess I was expecting certain information just to make sure that I can make sense of it later. But I always let people have markers to draw whatever they wanted. And certain things like travel routes, I could not draw a travel route listening to what people were saying. I would just give them the pen and say, you need to draw it, and because you're going to know it a lot better than I do. There's methods nowadays that are direct to digital where you're using a computer and you're basically creating GIS data right from this. I didn't choose that method, one, because I don't like it as much. I find that you get kind of lost in the computer and it's not as sociable in a way. The other is there's like really limited internet in Nunavut, so I could have been using GIS, but like Google Earth, if I was using it, I wouldn't be able to use it in different people's houses. So when an interview ends, this is kind of what you end up having. The picture on the left is an example of a map after an interview. There's not a lot of data on this one, partly just it makes it easier to explain what I'm doing through each step. But some of the interviews, I would have these just filled with lines and with points and different things from the interview. So the method I use to digitize or to georeference is I actually just laid them out flat on the floor, and I used a camera to take a photograph from straight above it. Some people who know this might say that's not the most precise or accurate way to do it. Some people will scan maps straight into, you know, where it's perfectly flat and being scanned. But I found that this method worked well enough for my purposes. Once you have a picture of it, you can bring it into your geographic information system, which I have a picture of on the right. I use ArcGIS. And you do what's called georeferencing. And you basically pick spots on the photograph and then match them to the geographic information in your GIS. And after you've done that 4 or 5, 6 times, the computer runs a program that sort of warps the photograph and lines it up with the geography in the geographic information system. So that's what's happened on the right. The map is basically, the picture is transparent and it's sort of above the GIS layers, but you can see through it to the GIS layers. So once you have that, you can start to go back to kindergarten and trace, and you draw out the information. And in addition to your tracing, you're writing information into a data table. So this is a little bit of a data table that I have here. So things like the code from the interview, the code for the actual feature that I'm doing is going in there. I had a master code, so all of the interviews combined have unique, all the features from every single interview combined have unique codes at the end. I would also I transcribed all my interviews and I put these codes into my transcription. So anytime I can go from this to my interviews to read more information, or I can go from my interviews to the GIS to know where things were talked about. I also recorded things like the season of the year that it was happening and the age that people were at, what time in history, like what year it happened or was happening. So there's more information than you're seeing here. Now I'm gonna go to the GIS. People can see the shift, right?
New share.
New share?
Yeah.
Yep, it's working.
Oh, it is working, okay. Still working?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the total extent of the data. You can see it's really focused around the central Kivalliq mostly, but I did get some data from pretty far away places because people had grown up or they lived in different communities. So that's the extent of everything I have. There's a whole bunch and you can't really tell what it is. I'm gonna go through a few different zooms. So we're gonna jump into the area around Rankin and Chester. So this is what it looks in a little more. Chester's around here, Rankin's around here. I ended up getting more interviews in Chester, so the data is a little bit more oriented towards Chester than Rankin. But that's what it looks like around. You can see there's really extensive land use. And now I'm gonna go into an area around Daly Bay. The map's gonna look a little different because I have different data sets popping up at different scales. So this is from the interviews. Each code means different things. But what I'm going to turn on now is these yellow lines. So I was lucky enough to be able to travel quite a bit in this area. And every time I traveled on the land with people, I would always try to bring my GPS. Sometimes I forgot, but for the most part, I would bring it. So the yellow lines are showing where I actually traveled. And I think they're pretty similar to the lines from interviews. In some areas, like right here, or there's some areas where I'm going into inlets where it's a little more refined, but overall I think that you get a pretty good sense that the interviews are probably pretty reliable in terms of how much they're representing people's experiences on the land. I mentioned the place names data earlier from IHT. So one great thing about data that can be shared, and not all data can be shared, is it can be really useful for projects. So all the pink dots are place names from the Inuit Place Names Project, and I use this data extensively. It helped me so much in my mapping and being able to show people where things were. Some of the data, the green dots are basically, sometimes there's errors in the data, and so people would say, no, that spot right there is not where that should be. So green is basically where people gave me place names that weren't in the IHT's data, or where I've sort of repositioned them based on what people were telling me. So just to wrap it up, I'm gonna, everything I just showed you, this is a few things what I've done with my thesis and where I'm going with it and how I'm analyzing the data. I'm gonna show here. One is, I've kind of, from my interviews and from my observations, one thing that I've really realized is at different ages, people learn different things. So like at a really young age, younger children, their experiences with the land tend to be around like fishing trips and camping trips that a lot of times are happening in the spring and the summer and not as rough weather as the middle of winter in the Arctic. And as they get older, they go on more strenuous and arduous hunting trips, and they start to do trips to further away. And then that continues as they grow older. But the amount that somebody's learning, like a new experience on the land as they grow older and older, is becoming less common because they've done it when they're younger. But every now and then there's a trip to further away, or there's a place they've never gone to, or there's an activity that they haven't done, like say hunting bowhead whales. That happens less often. So this one is showing winter activities. Basically, you're seeing at 0 to 9, there's not a whole bunch happening. Winter is very cold. It's usually -30 or below, and there's extreme winds. But by 10 to 19 years old, a lot more activity is happening, and the geographic extent is expanding out. By 20 to 29, the amount of so this is learning experiences. It's not all experiences on the land, but the amount of learning experiences maybe are reducing at 20 to 29, but there's examples where like there's this really long trip from Rankin Inlet to Baker Lake to go hunting that somebody did for the first time in their 20s. And then 30 and older, again, there's still there's new things being learned, but it's not as common as when you're younger. So that's one. Another thing I did is I mentioned camping, but camping and doing activities on the land with family is one of the most important ways that people learn the land and interact with the land. And this map is comparing the data from the Inuit Land Use and Occupancy Project with data from my interviews. So what I did, the data from the Inuit Land Use and Occupancy Project is not available as a GIS form as far as I know. Sort of as like data you can download. So I read the report, and every place a campsite was mentioned, I marked it. So I'm not necessarily putting them where they marked them in the interviews, but I'm getting fairly close. The red dots on the left map are showing campsites that were mentioned in the Rankin Inlet and Chesterfield Inlet interviews, and the yellow dots are from other communities. So I only interviewed people from Rankin and Chester, and that's what you're seeing on the right side, is maps or camping sites since 1970, post-1970, that I marked in my interviews. And I think that the distribution of sites is pretty similar. And you're seeing that the land is used in a very similar way to 1954 to 74. There's one interesting thing is in the sort of the northern portion of the map, you're getting some spots around, or some camping sites in what's called Ukosiksalik or Wager Bay, and even on the north end of Winter Island and Southampton Island. Part of that, I think, is actually changes in technology. Most people in the summer hunt by motorboat and have big engines, and they're able to travel fast. So that's part of what I think is happening there. So to just wrap it up, one thing I really want to emphasize, and what I've come to realize in this, is that all of this, what I've just presented, the participatory mapping and the GIS applications, they're essentially methods and tools to represent what Inuit already know, and they convey aspects of knowledge, but they are not the systems which generate and transmit knowledge. They offer exciting possibilities and ground-up representations of the world, which are oftentimes resistant to other representations of the world, yet they can never, ever actually replace the experience and the ways of generating knowledge and transmitting knowledge by interacting with other people, animals, landscapes, and other beings on the land. Through the interviews, I've learned a lot about Inuit history and Inuit experience about the land. But when I get out and I see and I experience a place that I've discussed, my learning takes on a whole new significance and meaning. And I know that Inuit would attest to this as well. So, you know, having a map show where people hunt is not the same as being out on the Hudson Bay hunting, or being kids playing on the ice while people are fishing, or chopping up meat in the middle of winter to feed to your dogs. It's just not the same. You have to do those things to be able to eventually map those things. And so at this point, my interests are like, how do I continue to work with community members and organizations who are interested in this type of project and doing this type of project, and have whatever we create be meaningful and useful? But at the same time, how do we support the systems of knowledge that generate and transmit this, and make sure that these projects are not trying to be the representations of knowledge, or, you know, they're not trying to they're supporting the systems of knowledge that are in place and that are existing and that have to exist for any of these projects to even happen. So that's the presentation. Thanks so much.